Last time in part one of our series on NASA's budget, we talked about how the president's request for NASA, the initial conditions of NASA's budget every year, comes together. And that's the interplay between the White House, between the Office of Management and Budget, and NASA itself. Now we're going to show you what happens next when the president delivers his budget here to Congress. Now, the act of funding the federal government every year is known as appropriations. And appropriations is just a fancy term for authorizing the Treasury to spend money on certain things. And the committee responsible for doing appropriations is, strangely enough, called the Appropriations Committee. The federal government is so big that there are 12 different subcommittees within the Appropriations Committee, each one with a different part of the government that it's responsible for. For example, we have one focused on defense, we have one focused on agriculture, one focused on transportation, and the one that we're concerned about here at the Planetary Society is called Commerce, Justice, and Science, CJS for short. Now, this subcommittee writes the very first draft of the bill that funds that part of government in both the House and the Senate side every year. They take the president's request and use that as their initial starting point, and then write their own version of the budget. If they start with some very good numbers for NASA at this very early point, that can ride through the entire process because they're funding so many different things at the same time that changes to that become harder and harder to make as it progresses through government. Now, before CJS can get started on writing this legislation, they need to know how much money they have to work with. And that's not decided in appropriations. That's decided over here in the House offices behind me that hold the Committee on the Budget. The House gets to determine, before it starts doing any appropriations, how much it wants to spend in total for the federal government that year. This is more of a policy statement than getting into the weeds, but it does set overall caps that everyone else has to work on. And once it works its way through that whole process, the House approves it, and it's just binding to the House. It isn't law, it's just their own direction. But once they have this direction, they bring it back here to the Appropriations Committee in the Capitol. Now, the Appropriations Committee takes this total number, let's say $1 trillion. That's roughly what we're dealing with every year. They give that to each other subcommittees in what's known as an allocation. They allocate that full trillion into each subcommittee. Now, this is not an equal process. Right away, the Defense Subcommittee gets about half of that money. The rest of it is divided between the 11 different subcommittees that fund the rest of the government. It is not until this point that CJS begins writing its bill for NASA and all of the other agencies that it has responsibility for. To get the draft bill into law, it needs to go through a series of votes. Now, each vote is going to involve more and more and more members of Congress. It is much harder to change or alter the bill at this late stage than it was at the very beginning when they were writing the legislation. By the way, this same process has been happening the whole time over at the Senate as well. And so there will be two bills for CJS, one passed by the House and one passed by the Senate. Now, they're going to be different. And to get them to be the same, the House and Senate have to mush them together and then take that compromise bill that comes out of that discussion and vote one last time on the House side and on the Senate side. And if they pass the same bill, then it finally ends up back here to the White House. Now, if the president is happy with the budget that's passed by the Senate and the House, they will sign it into law, and we will have a NASA budget for that year. And this usually happens around October, right when the previous year's funding is about to expire, and a full 18 or so months from when the White House first started working on this budget. If this seems complicated, it's okay, it is. And actually what we just talked about is the most ideal situation that could have happened, and it rarely works that way. This is why it's so important for the Planetary Society to be involved in this entire process, end to end, so that we can help NASA get the best budget it can every year. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about this topic, check out the link in the description to this video. Otherwise, you can always go to planetary.org/spaceadvocate.